Good afternoon, dear participants in the roundtable, dear viewers of the live broadcasting. My name is Anna Gorchakova. I'm a public relations director at the Gorchakov Fund. Let me announce our conference open. It will be dedicated to the Russian chairmanship and the Arctic Council problems and priorities, something which we implement together with the Center of the Project Office for the Development of the Arctic, or PORA. Good afternoon, dear participants in this conference. Good afternoon, dear viewers, those who watch us online. We are holding that event. I wanted to say that just proceeding on the eve, but actually Russia has already took over the baton, becoming the chair of the Arctic Council, and there were some assumptions what strategic goals Russia is going to offer, what it will bring to the Arctic Council, what it is going to speak about. And generally speaking, the goals have already been highlighted. Amid the tense political situation which is present for several years, the Arctic Council, according to the experts, remains a very good field for good cooperation. I'm not going to say that it is free from any issues or problems, but still I do think that such an interesting model for interaction can set an example for other organizations. In the course of today's roundtable, I would like to discuss how we see the work of the Arctic Council on behalf of the Russian expert community, what the foreign experts think about that, and what the Russian presidency in this council will do, and what will try to focus. Actually, what the outcomes of the Russian chairmanship in the Arctic Council is going to be. I think that I'm done with the introduction, and let's proceed with the discussion. Well, I do think that we'll start not with the discussion, but with the first point of our roundtable. It will include brief pitches on behalf of each of the speakers. Please stick to the 10-15 minutes time limit for your pitch, just highlighting the main bullet points which we're going to discuss during the Q&A session. I'm glad to pass the floor to Nikolay Korchunov, Ambassador at Large at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia, Senior Arctic Official of Russia to the Arctic Council. Thank you so much, Nikolay, for your time, for joining our discussion. We'll ask you to tell us about the priorities of the Russian program. What dramatically new Russia offers during its term, and what are the main priorities? Over to you. Thank you so much. I'd like to note that the main priority of the Russian chairmanship in the Arctic Council would be responsible management and governance for sustainable Arctic. That's a thematic important priority amid the intensive human activity and the climate change that the region is facing. We have to promote concerted action and sustainable development of the Arctic region, but certainly complying with the balance in its social, economic, and environmental dimensions. We have to bring about synergy, coordinated cooperation with other structures. We have to implement the strategic plan of the Arctic Council, which was adopted back in Reykjavik. The comprehensive program of the Russian chairmanship implies holding more than 100 different activities and events in partnership with our colleagues in the Arctic Council. We are about promoting multilateral cooperation in 4 main areas or directions. I could briefly name them. First of all, this is about the people, the Arctic population. Number 2, this is environment, including climate change. Number 3, social and economic development. Number 4, strengthening and improving the efficiency of the work of the Arctic Council. As for the first priority is concerned, it is tightly connected to the sustainable development. Sustainable development of the Arctic region will be dependent on how good our well-being is, how high the living standards are offered to the people of the Arctic region, thus about the human capital, will attach great importance to better sustainability and viability of the people living in the north, promoting measures to help them adapt for the climate change, to improve their well-being, health, saving the human capital, retaining the human capital, improving the education there, providing for the continuous economic development of the region. We suggest to use the rising potential of the Arctic for the benefit of all the northern people to promote cultural exchange, tourism, and contacts between the peoples and regions. I'd like to pay special attention to the fact that the adopted documents stress the importance of people-to-people contacts and contacts between the regions. The previous declarations and statements of the Arctic Council did not include that statement. And special attention would be paid to saving the cultural legacy of the indigenous people of the Arctic region, which is becomes even more significant, bearing in mind the Russian project on digitalizing the historical and linguistic legacy of the Aboriginal people, which becomes even more significant in the light of the decade of languages announced by the United Nations. We are going to speak a lot about the climate change. I'd like to focus on erosion and degradation of permafrost and greenhouse gas emissions. This is a topic which is relevant and painful not only for the Arctic region but also for Russia. It is relevant for Russia because 65% of the Russia's territory, that's permafrost. We will also focus on the measures to mitigate the climate change, to adapt for better sustainability in that light, for the economical use of the natural resources, how to support the maritime resources, how to somehow preserve its diversity, including the transit birds. We will hold the third Congress on biodiversity, and a special attention will be paid to the initiative concerning the Arctic birds, and Russia is one of the masterminders of that initiative. For the further development of the region, we have to focus not only on the vulnerability of the region and how to adapt for that, but we have to look at the Arctic region as an important region to boost and provide for decision making. The Arctic region actually is rich in natural resources, and we can offer some transport solutions to transit to carbon-free and a low-emission economy in order to comply with the Paris Climate Agreement. We will certainly support the energy-saving technologies, technological solutions, and investments into the power generation sector and other sectors. To this end, we're going to hold a number of activities and events along with our partners and with observers. Social and economic development will also remain in the spotlight. The prerequisite for better well-being and flourishing of the Arctic region lies in its raising of the living standard and economic development. The census showed that where the economic growth is noted, the number of the population is growing too. That's especially important for the Arctic region. We'll also promote international cooperation in the Arctic region and develop reliable transport infrastructure, including maritime transportation and telecom systems. We'll consider the questions of inviting more investments to the region, promoting innovations, entrepreneurship, how to fund the business. Clearly, it would be crucial to develop entrepreneurship among the youth. There are certain plans to arrange a startup challenge for young IT entrepreneurs. We also attach great importance not to setting up new institutions, but to raise the synergy among the existing one, to multiply our efforts. We are going to use brainstorming and core chairmanship tools along with Economic Council and along with relying on the chambers of commerce of the region. I think that it will give us a boosted effect to discuss the economic issues and problems with a special focus on supporting local manufacturers, SMEs, traditional handicraft. Also, we will bring for the consideration of the Arctic Council the topic of interaction between indigenous people and the business, how PPPs, public-private partnerships, can be set up to support local peoples, Aboriginal peoples. We will take advantage of our chairmanship in order to promote the local manufacturers and producers to the international markets. We think that it would be a very effective tool to support the local economy. With the same token, we're going to pay attention to making the Arctic Council as one of the tools to promote cooperation, international cooperation, through improving the methods and technologies of its work, raising the efficiency of the work of the Secretariat working groups, developing certain funding mechanisms of the Council, including projects and programs. Will focus on further dialogue and contacts with observers. Big attention would be paid to engaging observers to the balanced and effective work of the Arctic Council. And we're going to further optimize the interaction between the Arctic Council and the Arctic Economic Council, coastline protection councils, and other core institutions. And with the same token, we are going to boost the cooperation between the youth. Our priorities also lie in the area of promoting scientific cooperation. We'll focus on whether the Arctic Council member states can make a joint mission in the Arctic seas. I will stop at that and will be ready to answer any questions. I will join other topics which could be raised by the forum. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. As a moderator, may I have two quick questions? Question number one. Well, in the project office for the development of the Arctic, we held a lot of events and activities dedicated to the future chairmanship of Russia in the Arctic Council. There was a question. Is there any differentiator, anything brand new that Russia would offer as a chair of the Arctic Council? And the second question, aren't you afraid that our good ideas, whether our good ideas could be detached from the public policy or international agenda? Because any good idea can be dubbed as a treacherous program of Russia. Well, Russia is one of the biggest Arctic council of the Arctic nations. We take a comprehensive approach to any issues. We cannot afford selecting a tiny piece of something or certain segment of our broad program. For us, that's very important in 2 years to keep the Arctic nations consolidated in terms of responsible management of the Arctic region. If it doesn't happen, will not fulfill the objective put forward by the ministers to keep the Arctic region as the area of peace and low military and political tension. So we'll not reinvent the wheel. This is not our objective, but rather we'll take a comprehensive, responsible approach, keeping succession and continuity. If chairs differ in their approaches and offer certain novelties, it won't be right. As I said, the comprehensive approach is very important for us, and the general international agenda certainly is quite important. Experts from the military speak about spillover effect once a certain conflict breaks out, and whether it will have a spillover effect on the cooperation in the Arctic region, but it will undermine our efforts there, so no one is interested in that. Prior to offering certain initiatives, Russia is going to confer in its partners in order to avoid a situation when in order to avoid losses to our image damage, so to say. We need a no-nonsense, pragmatic approach to all the issues. Therefore, we are not just clinging to the initiatives. We are not just forcing them down. Well, I would like all our partners to share this, your pragmatic approach. Then we'll have less problems. I'd like to pass the floor to Mr. Nikonorov, Professor Director of the Center for Studies of Economic Problems of Arctic Development, Faculty of Economics, Lomonosov, Moscow State University, Sustainable Development Expert at PORA, or Project Office for the Development of the Arctic. Over to you, Sergey. I know that you have prepared a sustainable development rating for the Arctic Council member states. Let me share my screen. I hope that you can see that very well, but prior to that, I would like to say I would like to express my gratitude to Mr. Korchunov. It's very difficult to say something else. He is very structured in his statements. Let me start with the words of gratitude. Can I extend my thanks? Just like any book starts with the words of thanks. This is thanks to Mr. Korchunov that now you see this rating, and it is not done yet, it is not ready yet, but this is thanks to Mr. Korchunov. Thanks to his positive feedback, we at the Faculty of Economics now have a special course for managers, which is called Managing Sustainable Development. And let me quote from Mr. Korchunov: we are training responsible managers for sustainable Arctic region. This is something which we try to do today. I will start with that because all your statements and remarks that you make, we take into consideration trying to keep pace with the time, doing everything on time and very effectively. Let me go step by step. First of all, let me show that the public policy of different nations in the Arctic may be different and will not show something totally new, but let me highlight certain bullet points. The Arctic nations, but also the observers, they have their own Arctic strategy for their development. And these are the countries not only members of the Arctic Council, but certain areas and certain priorities are shown here on the slide. You may see that Denmark, Iceland, Canada, Norway, Russia, the United States, Finland, and Sweden have certain goals and certain directions of the public policy. And we can see whether we can reconcile all these objectives, whether they coincide. But I'd like to say that we'd rather aim our efforts at focusing on the observer nations because they have their own Arctic-driven objectives. Once you listen to the French consul or a representative from China, you will see that they have very long-term goals in terms of the Arctic area. And the Council of Estonia, for instance, and this is for the Russian Foreign Ministry to note, and Mr. Korchunov probably knows that, but for instance, said that Estonia wants to become an observer. They even have a leaflet which outlines certain concepts and certain issues that they're ready to address. And if Russia makes sure that Estonia becomes an observer within the Arctic Council, there are other things such as energy partnership between different countries, such as Russia, Korea, Japan, a very interesting area.
Then there is another interesting area of work. You mentioned investment, Mr. Korchunov. We could consider green funding. This is another subject we have discussed a lot of times. Maybe we should set up an international green bank based on an international Scandinavian bank. Or maybe we should just set up a green bank based on the member states of the Arctic Council. And in addition, we could invite observer nations. This would be a new initiative which will pursue a win win strategy. On the one hand, this is an initiative coming from Russia, but the agenda is green. We're supporting green projects in the Arctic. We are supporting sustainable development. All the member states have some things in common: fighting climate change, developing social infrastructure, preserving biodiversity, fighting pollution, mitigation and adaptation to climate change. And there is one more point we should be aware of. The Northern Sea route, the Arctic Sea route, will play a bigger role. China calls it the Ice Silk Way or road. So China has very specific plan for this icy Silk Road, but it's a question for Russia whether Russia is ready for that. Do we know? Do we have specific plans for using this sea route for transporting goods from China? Okay, I will not go over all the different observer statuses in the Arctic Council. I will skip this slide. There's just one point here that can cause some controversy. This is Spitsbergen issue, 200-mile zone, uh, which countries certain areas should belong to: Denmark, Iceland, or Russia. The law of the sea. What about sovereignty claims in the Arctic? There is a pretty long list of questions, but sooner or later they can be resolved. If there is a will, there is a way. And even a country like Turkey or the European Union with its 27 members, they're also present at the meetings. They are limited observers. And in addition, there is an independent body, the Arctic Economic Council. So we need to see clearly what the difference is between the Arctic Council and the independent Arctic Economic Council. Okay, business standards, technology sharing, and first and foremost, renewable energy. Also, the blue economy. Maybe instead of a green economy, we should be talking about blue economy for the Arctic, giving higher priority to people, people being at the heart of everything. Of course, different countries have different priorities. Again, I will skip this slide. The US had its priorities, Russia had its priorities, Finland, environment protection. Russia prioritized man made disasters and radiation. But Mr. Korchunov has just mentioned our priorities for our next stint. of presidency in the Arctic Council. Okay, when we look at problems in the Arctic Council, it's hard to cooperate in culture, as strange as it may seem, preserving history and traditions of indigenous people, specifically languages, because languages are the reflection of history, culture, and tradition. Then ocean stewardship and biodiversity. Now let's move on. How are we going to develop this rating, sustainable development rating for member states in the Arctic Council? We will be talking about these 8 countries. Even though I hope that for the future, and we already have specific plans for that, we plan to use some other colleagues whom we plan to invite to this project, specialists in a number of different areas. Our intention is to create a rating. For the time being, we will only include the member states, but later on, we will add observer countries. So from 2011 to 2030, and of course, we cannot be sure of the final date at this point, but the plan is to go until 2030. We just want to start working, create something. And we will have to evaluate every year, year by year, 11, 12, 13, and all the way to 19. Here are the criteria that we will use for our Sustainable Development Index. Please don't confuse SDI with SDG. SDG is Sustainable Development Goal Index. We will use 3 major macro indices. One of them was mentioned earlier today by Nikolay Korchunov, HDI, Human Development Index. So to us, this is the socioeconomic aspect. Then HPI, this includes inequality, life expectancy, and satisfaction. And there is a very interesting criteria, environmental footprint. And then EEI, Environmental Economic Index. This includes a pretty broad range of environmental indices, pollution levels, forestation and deforestation levels. All the indicators we use in this index are evaluated either by the UN or by the World Bank. So our plan was to come up with this environmental/economic index, a kind of all-inclusive index. And this will look a bit like a Russian doll, like Matryoshka. People are at the heart of everything. And then let's take 2030 and we can extrapolate, we can continue to 2050. We decided to take 2030 for the time being, so as not to put the date into a too distant future. So we want to see how these 3 points work together: the government, business, and society, people, general public. Where is Russia? Where is Russia going in terms of each of the criteria individually, and using the overall index, the final index that we get as a result, Sustainable Development Index. And then we need to to see how much we differentiate from SDG indicators. How different is our index from the SDGs? Are we close to their indicators or not? And of course, we'll use SDG indicators as estimated by the UN. And of course, we face a lot of difficulties with that. Let's take Iceland, for example. It turns out for Iceland, it's really hard to find some data. We just don't have enough data available. Or let's take Denmark, another member state. With Denmark, we have to count certain things 3 times because they have the Greenland, the Faroe Islands, Denmark itself. Of course, all these issues can be resolved. This can be done. And we don't even want to show you our preliminary estimates at this point. We do have some preliminary calculations. We'll show you some results closer to the fall. We'll show you where Russia was in 2011 and the following years, and where Russia is today, and where we think Russia will be based on these indicators. That's all from me. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't take too much of your time, and I'm happy to answer whatever questions you might have. Thank you. Thank you for such an exhaustive presentation, Mr. Nikonorov. Our colleagues may have some questions, but let's save them for later on. And right now we go to Norway, Mr. Rottem, Senior Fellow of the Nansen Institute. Mr. Rottem will talk to us about the format of the Arctic Council and explain what the Arctic Council looks like now. And also, I think he will talk about the Reykjavik meeting. Please, Mr. Rottem.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this seminar. It's great to see you again. When talking about the Arctic Council, I always start up by telling what the Arctic Council is, because that's the core here. And we have to remember that the Arctic Council is a consensus forum and has no ability to enforce its recommendations. They are only politically binding. That's the key message, very important to bear in mind. Thus, the Arctic Council is shaping decisions and only making politically binding decisions. So it's a decision shaping, not a decision making forum. And the core of the Arctic Council is really the scientific cooperation in the working groups. They are the most, there is where the most important work happens. And this work provides input to global environmental agreements, for example, the Stockholm Convention, the Minamata Convention, and so on and so forth, and of course, the global climate regime. And of course, the Arctic Council has cooperation on maritime issues like search and rescue and oil spill preparedness, and so on and so forth. But most important, the Arctic Council is a place where one could find common ground on environmental issues and climate issues in the region, and it's not a legally binding instrument. And the new strategy from the ministerial meeting in Reykjavik doesn't change that. The strategy was really following up the tradition of the Arctic Council. Really not something new, but very interesting that they could find common ground and publish a strategy for the Arctic Council for the first time. I think they've been working on this paper for 6 years now. So congratulations to the Russian South, for example. But shortly, what was the main news from the ministerial meeting? I will just give a brief introduction, or rather my take on what was the key lessons from that meeting. There were 3 issues that were heading the agenda. What would happen when we saw the swift shift from the Trump administration to the Biden administration? Secondly, were security issues on the Arctic Council agenda? And thirdly, how was the Russian chairmanship? What was the key message from the Russian chairmanship? Looking to the issue on the shift from Trump administration to the Biden administration, this was a huge step if you look at the Arctic Council. If you look at the Arctic Council meeting two years ago, which were much more heated, and of course that has a lot to do with the Trump administration and its take on climate issues. And for the Biden administration, clearly climate change is the key message to the Arctic Council meeting. And no surprises there. Blinken focused on climate issues and environmental issues, and it was in a friendly tone. And we could say that the Arctic Council, following up what the Arctic Council is a perfect venue for this, because by stating politically that climate change is important, you don't make any final decisions, but you're doing a symbolic important thing. You're portraying the Arctic as a key place where we see climate change is happening. Secondly, this is not something new. Climate change has been on the top of the Arctic Council agenda for 20 years now. So really, the Trump administration was a bit out of time, really, and the Biden administration is following up what has been the key message from the Arctic Council in the last 20 years. So really not. So we saw a revitalized US take on the work of the Arctic Council. Okay, secondly, security issues, were they on the Arctic Council agenda? Still, I would say, and I think the key message was really that the Arctic Council should not become an arena for political power struggle. It is a place to meet in geopolitically more strained times. Lavrov put security on the agenda, but was a misunderstanding among many that the Arctic Council should include security issues. What Lavrov, as I understood him, was talking about was that it was a revitalization of the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable, and that is something different than the Arctic Council. So, key message again, keeping security issues, hard security issues, of the Arctic Council agenda. This created some fuss, but I think the message from the Russian chairmanship is still that the Arctic Council should stay as it is. And then the Russian chairmanship, a very interesting presentation from the Russian Sao. As he said, and my impression is as well, there were no big surprises. Many ideas and many good ideas, and I think that's an excellent working plan, really. Not to make any huge structural changes with the Arctic Council or put something brand new on the Arctic Council agenda. And really, a key message was also that we should that Russia is acknowledging global warming as a serious problem, which is clearly in line with the Biden administration as well. And thirdly, underscoring sustainable development, if we could find something new, because my take is really that the Russian chairmanship is focusing more on the economic dimension of sustainable development. It is important, really, a key message is really that it is important to keep people in the Arctic by creating good living conditions for the Arctic people. And lastly, Russia wished to show itself as a responsible actor in the North. So let's sum up. I would say that the main message from the Arctic Council meeting in Reykjavik was really cooperation, 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 and don't fix what is not broken. All member states see that and said that on the Arctic Council meeting, and they have common interests and underlining common interests in keeping it that way. Lastly, just to mention it, at the sideline, clearly, Blinken and Lavrov met for the first time. I heard it was a, kind of harmonious meeting. The same was the Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs met with Lavrov. And again, the Arctic Council is a place where you can discuss issues that are not regional Arctic issues in itself, but you can also discuss broader issues, but that they are not part of the Arctic Council agenda as such. But the Arctic Council is a good place to meet and discuss other serious issues in a more geopolitical strained time. I think I will stop there and looking forward to the discussion. This was really the key message, I would say, from the Reykjavik meeting. I don't know if any, well, maybe some disagree, but the key message was really huge shift from the Trump to the Biden administration, security issues still not on the Arctic Council agenda, and the Russian chairmanship, many good ideas, and but no big surprises. Thank you.
Спасибо большое, Svein, спасибо.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sven. That's a favorite phrase of any mechanician or mechanical engineer. Don't fix what is not broken. I'm passing the floor to Mr. Sergunin, a Doctor of Political Sciences professor from the Faculty of International Relations of St. Petersburg State University, Department of Theory and History of International Relations. Some time ago, we discussed the future chairmanship of Russia in the Arctic Council, and we discussed who will be the future president. You said that actually Biden or Trump, that would make the difference. And secondly, you said that you're not sure whether security issues have to be incorporated into the agenda of the Arctic Council. Can you focus on that? Thank you. First of all, let me thank you, the organizers, for inviting me to take part in that roundtable. And I'm taking part in similar events for about 6 months, just like many of you present at that roundtable discussion. Therefore, it was very interesting to keep track of how Russia's strategy regarding the Arctic Council developed, and Mr. Korchunov was quite frank in his interviews, in his contributions at different scientific forums in the preceding 6 months. Therefore, we had a very good impression, grasp of what the Russian program for the chairmanship would look like. But now we got the official reiteration of that agenda. Now, the working plan on certain events was published, was disclosed. Now we have many more food to contemplate on, so to say. Well, Mr. Korchunov spoke about the official stance. Let me focus on more conceptual items. I will start with such a thing as the following: prior to Russia taking the chairmanship in the Arctic Council, the political situation around Russia in the Arctic region in particular was quite tense, was not favorable. The blame could be put on Donald Trump's administration, which pursued the deterrence of Russia and China in containment of Russia and China in the Arctic region. For a year and a half, such agencies as the Defense Department, as the Coast Guard, and the Oval Office took a whole range of doctrines and policies which stated that the Arctic region is no longer an area of peace and friendship, but rather an area of confrontation and rivalry. And you have to be prepared for that rivalry. The main stakeholders there would be the United States heading the West, and on the other side of the barricades, you will find Russia and China. And arbitrary, meaning that you do not know which rival is more dangerous. At the ministerial meeting of the Arctic Council, the joint declaration was not adopted because Mike Pompeo refused to sign it, as climate change was mentioned in the final statement. Mike Pompeo made a pitch before that ministerial meeting, blaming Russia and China for its expansionist policy. After, Joe Biden came to power, there were some expectations that the policy towards Russia would change, but on the contrary, even more sanctions were introduced, and it cast doubt whether the climate would be favorable for the Russian chairmanship in the Arctic region, in the Arctic Council. But Biden's administration still managed to take a sober position and exclude the Arctic from the area of confrontation with Russia and China. Let Mr. Korchunov correct me, but coming to power of Joe Biden made it possible that the Arctic Council agreed on a number of initiatives, something that Iceland failed to do. Actually, I didn't believe that Iceland as a chair would bring to a favorable end the development of the working plan. And you know that's great that Iceland managed to do that, and Russia will not have to apply efforts to finalize this working plan, but will work on bringing that into life. Besides, Iceland managed to develop a number of documents to make progress in the most important areas of the activity of the Arctic Council, for instance. This is the updated climate change report in the Arctic region. Biodiversity, terrestrial biodiversity report. Also, the Regional Action Plan on Marine Litter in the Arctic, Gender Equality in the Arctic report, and I'm one of the co-authors there. I wrote a chapter about gender security. And last but not least, the summary of progress and recommendations from the Council's expert group on black carbon and methane. That's a very important area of the work of the Arctic Council and its expert groups. What changed in the Russian position related to the Arctic Council once the country got prepared to take the chairmanship? Russia sent a clear message that it no longer wants to transform the Arctic Council from the intergovernmental organization into an supranational organization, a multilateral organization with its charter and certain documents to be adopted. Why? Russia changed its positions. Back in 2013-2014, Minister Lavrov said that would like to make the Arctic Council translate into a more full-fledged organization with more powers and authority. I think Russia decided to take a more pragmatic approach. Amid the tensions between Russia and the Western partners, the other members of the Arctic Council, that position was clearly stated by Washington. Russia realized that the Western nations would not like to see another full-fledged organization where Russia could make its input into setting strict rules. On the other hand, it became obvious that amid today's conflict situation and context, less formal and more flexible international institutions such as the Arctic Council or BRICS, as an example, can be more useful than rigid, structured international organizations such as the United Nations or some ad hoc institutions, or the OSCE, etc., etc. Unfortunately, once confrontation between Russia and the West exacerbated after the Ukrainian crisis broke out, these organizations proved to be inefficient. And they showed their inefficiency. But BRICS, for instance, without being bound by certain terms and conditions, could react more flexibly and adapt for the changing context. Probably the decisions that they take were not so binding, but these organizations proved to be quite viable. Pragmatic approach played its role. That's why the country changed its position, and therefore the Arctic Council could be transformed into a new shape, but without translating into a full-fledged organization, supranational organization. So back to the question whether Moscow, well, Russia is going to militarize the agenda. Many Russian officials stated that we do not want to bring the military security issues to the agenda of the Council. Otherwise, it would cause a lot of problems for the activity of the Arctic Council. We'd like to preserve that the way we inherited it from the earlier days. The Arctic Council should not deal with the hard military security, but rather has to deal with the soft policies such as the destiny of the indigenous peoples and on maritime navigation, cooperation, friendship, climate change, everything which actually is human-driven. Despite the fact that Russia is not going to impose on the Arctic Council any security issues, it doesn't rule it out that the dialogue in that area continues in such formats as Arctic Coast Guard Forum, Arctic Chiefs of Defense Staff Conferences, Arctic Security Forces Roundtable, etc., etc. So these are the formats which existed before. I mean the last two, but they were put on a hold after the Ukrainian crisis broke out, when the contacts between the Russian military and the Western military were suspended. The Arctic Coast Guard Forum was set up in autumn 2015 after the Ukrainian crisis broke out, and although with certain hiatus, it still goes on working and does it quite efficiently. I think that we can accelerate our work along these lines. And to conclude my remarks, several words about the changes in the conceptual basis of the foundations of the Russian Arctic strategy. Over the last 10 or 12 years, Russia dramatically changed its concept of the Arctic strategy. In compliance with the first strategic document adopted by the Russian Federation in 2008, when Dmitry Medvedev was sworn in as the president, the main idea was to make the Arctic area of the Russian Federation a strategic natural resources asset. This is something which we inherited from the Soviet times, when the main objective was to discover and develop the natural resources there. In 2013, it was superseded by another Arctic strategy, which focused on the sustainable development, although the economic pillar of that concept was still number one, and social and environmental pillars or components were secondary. And finally, the concept of the Arctic strategy evolved and was finalized in March 2020, when other strategic documents were adopted, focusing on a man and other social and humanitarian issues. Just a couple of examples from the modern Arctic strategy of the Russian Federation. Also, the strategy is planned until 2030, and it focuses on the social policy, including development of the healthcare system, reform of the secondary and higher education, adapting for the needs of the Arctic region, better access to infrastructure, etc., etc. Let me skip one of the slides and let me proceed with the priorities of the Russian chairmanship in the Arctic Council. These priorities are in full compliance with the strategy which we adopted for our domestic purposes. So the top priority is the people of the Arctic region. Second, that's environmental protection, including climate change, social and economic development, and strengthening of the Arctic Council. I would argue, Sven said that economic issues are the top priority for Russia, but this is not true. This is a man, the people of the Arctic region, including the Aboriginal people, that are our top priority there for our strategy. And these are not just empty words or some political rhetoric. It has become part and parcel, an integral part of our domestic policy. Not something which sets the priorities for the chairmanship in the Arctic Council, but elsewhere as well. Our speakers stressed that Russia will not suggest something dramatically new or something disruptive, but I'd say that this is not true as well. For instance, the previous chairs did not suggest anything to promote the so-called scientific diplomacy, but Russia wants to make a real breakthrough in the area of Arctic discovery and research. This year, a meeting of the ministers of science of the Arctic Council member states is planned for this year. Some joint land and marine expeditions will be launched. For instance, Polar Stern and Snowflake expedition is going to be launched, etc., etc. In 2022, an Arctic Meteorological Summit will take place, and it will be accompanied by a number of other events in order to boost scientific diplomacy in the Arctic, in order to create interdependence and confidence building mechanisms in the Arctic. And I will stop at that. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for clarifying the Russian position, complementing what Mr. Korchunov said. Thank you for clarifying the Russian stance on the hard security issues. I think that we'll discuss that during Q&A session. Saying that, I would like to pass the floor to Timo Koivurova, research professor of the Arctic Center, University of Lapland, Finland. He will tell us about the structure of the Arctic Council and about the significance and meaning of the chairmanship in the Arctic Council and what the international community expects from the Russian chairmanship. Over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. So good afternoon and greetings from Rovaniemi, Finland, and kind thanks for the invitation. So I will say a few words about the role of a chair country in the Arctic Council in general and what, in my view, the international community expects from the Russian chairmanship in the Council that has now started and ends in 2023. I was myself fairly heavily involved in implementing the Finland's chairship during 2017 to 2019, and I can certainly say that I learned a lot, even if I had been involved in the work of the Council before this. As most of you know, the Arctic Council is an intergovernmental forum, not an intergovernmental organization, and of course, Svein already very elaborately told us about these issues. Between the 8 Arctic states, the 5 Nordic states, Russia, the US, and Canada, Indigenous Peoples International Organizations have a very strong role in the Council as its permanent participants, which need to be consulted before any decision-making by the member states. There are also a lot of observers. There are altogether, as far as I remember, 38, of which 13 are nation states. European Union is a de facto observer. Most of the work is done in the 6 working groups of the Council in areas of environmental monitoring, and environmental protection, sustainable development. But over the years, the issues have grown to also other common issues that the Arctic countries are facing. So with the increasing interest in Arctic issues, the Arctic Council has also developed to a more ambitious intergovernmental forum. It has catalyzed already 3 legally binding agreements between the Arctic states, and also catalyzed international bodies such as the Arctic Coast Guard Forum and the Arctic Economic Council, all of which are formally independent from the Council. The Council has nowadays also a permanent secretariat in Tromsø, Norway, which has also meant that some of the duties that were previously handled by the chair country are now taken care of by the secretariat. Still, the chairmanship has retained its importance in the Arctic Council. First of all, chair countries leave their marks on the work of the Arctic Council by adopting and implementing a chair program with which it can raise issues that it considers important, even if these priority areas need to be in general in line with the objectives of the Arctic Council. Hence, we can observe that, for instance, the US chairmanship 2015-2017 emphasized especially climate change and ocean stewardship. Finland 2017-2019 built on Paris Climate Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals because these had just been adopted, but also emphasized preconditions for viable Arctic communities, so digital connectivity, education, meteorology, for instance. Or Iceland now, that placed quite naturally lots of emphasis on ocean issues, 1921. And now, of course, we are talking about Russia, which places heavy emphasis on sustainable Arctic growth and development. I would underline that we should not see too much difference as regards these priorities, as these need to be aligned with the Arctic Council objectives. So the chairmanship in general is a long one. So if one compares that to other intergovernmental organizations or other intergovernmental forums, it's 2 years, and it is considered a possibility for the chair country, as it can advance its own priorities, projects, and initiatives in the work of the Council. It has also been important that the chair countries have organized the Senior Arctic Official and Sustainable Development Working Group and other meetings and conferences, mostly in their Arctic regions, thereby consolidating the view in the country of its Arcticness. It is the chair country that leads the Council during its chairmanship, and the foreign ministry is the formal lead of the Council and represents the country in the foreign ministers meeting that ends the country's chair period. The chair country leads the Senior Arctic Official meetings, the SAO meetings, the highest executive body of the Council. I would personally emphasize the importance of the chair in leading the discussions in the Senior Arctic Official meetings, because it is this body and it is the chair of the Senior Arctic Officials and his or her team that is continuously taking care of all general issues related to the Arctic Council. It is really the chair and her team of the Senior Arctic Officials that has a lot on his or her shoulders. A good chair is not only following procedural steps or rules, but needs to be well equipped to steer the discussion to topics that are crucial to the goals of the Arctic Council, and at the same time have the capacity to steer the discussion in a way that conflicts can be avoided. The Council is a consensus body, so a good chair tries to find via a lot of work what is the common ground for countries and permanent participants to move forward in these different work areas of the Council. So the chair country is not chairing everything in the Council, it is chairing the ministerial meeting, SAO meetings, Sustainable Development Working Group meetings, and just to recall that this is one of the 6 working groups of the Arctic Council. Other working groups are not chaired by the chair country. It is also chairing the expert group on black carbon and methane. If there are task forces, and now there are none, as far as I understand, these are also chaired by chair country. Normally also the national of the chair country is nominated to be the chair of the Arctic Economic Council and the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, even if these bodies are formally independent from the Arctic Council. In addition, the chair country has various established ways of interacting with the observers, and it represents the Council in international forums when it can. I mean, this is also driven by consensus. The question was posed to me by the organizers: what does the international community expect of Russia's chairmanship And so let me give some few kind of angles to this. First of all, and obviously the first thing that is that all the participants in the, let's say, the Arctic Council community, other member states, permanent participants, observers, they expect that there is a continuation of progress in attaining the long-term goals of the Council. And the first long-term strategy obviously kind of puts more heavy emphasis on that when it was now adopted finally in the ministerial meeting in Reykjavik. And Russia has been expressing its intention to strengthen the Arctic Council and following up on the long-term strategy. Second, it is of much importance that Russia engages in the problematic issues of funding during the chairmanship, and this is some of the expressed intents of Russia during the and on the base of its chairmanship program. Overall, Russia clearly expresses its willingness to use its chairmanship to advance international cooperation via its chairmanship. And here it is important that it keeps the Arctic Council engaged with, for instance, the additions needed for the Polar Code, and envisaging the possible role for the Arctic Council as a regional implementation body for the United Nations possible agreement to govern the biodiversity in high seas of the Central Arctic Ocean, a negotiation process called the BBNJ, which may result in such a global agreement. On both of these issues, there is already kind of work ongoing in the Arctic Council. This is important, this kind of international aspect, given that we have tensions between the Western states and Russia. We should not kind of brush this aside. There are lots of different sanctions regimes targeted from USA, from EU to Russia, and then there are counter sanctions, and also from other Western states. In these circumstances, international cooperation in the Arctic is important for trying to at least here to proceed with orderly relations in the Arctic region, and that the Council is enabled to continue with important climate, environment, and sustainable development work. And all of these were kind of expressed by Foreign Minister Lavrov in the Reykjavik ministerial meeting. He clearly went beyond the Arctic Council cooperation to other forms of international cooperation, and also to this kind of what used to be before the Crimean annexation, this general cooperation between the 8 Arctic states, between their chiefs of defense staff. And this expression has already been heard before, that these type of forum would be good to resume. I think he was not referring to the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable, which is a larger get-together, not only including the Arctic states, but also others, and it is still convening, and Russia just withdrew it after the Crimean events. So that's, I think, something that we are looking forward. And finally, in my view, and probably also for many others, 2 interconnected issues create additional expectations also from the Russian chairmanship: climate change and how to govern the melting Arctic sea areas. The biggest driver of changes in the Arctic is climate change, which the Arctic Council alone cannot obviously solve, but it can do much. There are expectations that Russia would be able to effectively lead the work of the expert group that tries to reduce black carbon and methane in the Arctic. It is chairing this particular expert group. Second, we have already lost 75% of the volume of the Arctic sea ice since 1979. That's a fairly dramatic figure. There's a distinct need to come up with effective methods of sustainable ocean governance, given the vastly changing and melting marine ecosystems of the Arctic waters due to the climate change. If the Arctic Council wants to credibly say that it is a responsible steward of the Arctic region, these issues need to be faced, and for the next few years, these expectations are most clearly directed at Russia as its chair. Thanks very much.
Спасибо большое, Тимо, за такое достаточно интересное, содержательное выступление. Я хотел бы сейчас передать слово Павлу Девяткину.
Thank you, Timo. I give the floor now to Pavel Devyatkin, representing the Arctic Institute in the US. Pavel, whatever they say, bilateral cooperation between Russia and the US affects all the organizations, including the Arctic Council. So maybe you could cover and talk a little bit about bilateral interaction between our 2 countries, please.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues and friends, thank you for inviting me and for the chance to share my perspective. I agree with what my esteemed colleagues have said before me regarding the importance of people-to-people contacts and cooperation. As the only American on this panel, I will give an overview of US-Russia relations in the Arctic and make the point that now, more than ever, Russia has a potential to be a leader in saving the Arctic. The tensions between the West and Russia must be overcome, and the focus of Arctic policymaking must be on the threat of climate change. US-Russia relations are, in general, at a historic low, but 2020 was an unprecedented year in US-Russia tensions in the Arctic. For the first time since the end of the Cold War, NATO warships entered the Barents Sea just off Russia's Arctic coast in May 2020. A few months later, the Russian Navy conducted military exercises in the Bering Sea near Alaska, surprising a group of nearby American fishermen. Such military activity threatens the stability of the Arctic. Military activity remains low compared to during the Cold War, but it's increasing and alarming in this region which has not seen interstate conflict since World War II. It's rarely mentioned in Western analyses of Arctic security that the Russian North was invaded twice by Western troops in the 20th century, first during the foreign intervention in the Russian Civil War, and then by Nazi Germany as part of the Murmansk operation, or Silver Fox. So it's no surprise that the Arctic is a sensitive place. But what can be done to maintain the Arctic peace? As the US and Russia grow suspicious of each other's actions in the region, it is important to remember the invaluable work of the Arctic Council in mutually beneficial cooperation and maintaining peace and stability. There are opportunities for engaging with each other, especially in the areas of scientific research and environmental protection, both key areas in the Arctic Council's agenda. American presidents have consistently entered the White House declaring their aim to cooperate or reach an understanding with Russia, but President Biden did not and made undiplomatic comments about his Russian counterpart. The outlook is grim, but at the recent Arctic Council ministerial meeting in Reykjavik, Lavrov and Blinken both reaffirmed their country's commitments to cooperation and maintaining a predictable relationship. Despite the political tensions, the climate emergency is threatening the entire world with dire consequences. Time is too short, and we cannot afford to accept the increasing risk of climate catastrophe because of political squabbling. Cooperation is critical. As John Kerry said, we have just 9 years to avert the worst consequences of the climate catastrophe. But by then, it'll be too late. The Arctic, which is now warming at 3 times the global average, is one of the regions in the world most severely affected. So the fact remains that the climate crisis is intensifying, and it's high on the agendas of both the US and Russian governments. Russia published an official climate change adaptation plan in 2020. The plan highlighted the severe droughts, wildfires, extreme weather, floods, deforestation, and the degradation of permafrost in the north. The new awareness is welcome, but it is meaningless without actual policies. There are similar environmental hazards in the US Arctic in Alaska. The dramatic environmental changes are especially hurting indigenous people who have lived in the Arctic for millennia. But this kind of urgency wasn't always there. Former Secretary of State Pompeo gave a climate skeptic speech before the Arctic Council meeting in 2019, which was heavily criticized, especially by Inuit leaders who called it a moral failure that Pompeo refused to sign the joint declaration because it mentioned climate change. This is horrendous that the US representative's destructive behavior endangered climate action for the whole world. Even our respected colleague, Professor Koivurova, was asking, is this the end of the Arctic Council and Arctic governance as we know it? But now the Biden administration has rejoined the Paris Agreement, and the Defense Department has even designated climate change as a national security threat. President Putin attended the White House's virtual climate summit, and the two presidents agreed to cooperate on climate, especially in the area of carbon capture. This development is welcome, but let's remain skeptical until real action is taken. Most greenhouse gases are not emitted from the Arctic, but scientific research and collaboration are crucially needed for climate adaptation in this dramatically changing region, especially after the COVID pandemic has largely frozen Arctic research. So given these overlapping concerns, there's a lot of room for cooperation in the Arctic. I'd like to share a few cases from history. One of the earliest examples of scientific dialogue is the correspondence between polymaths Mikhail Vasilyevich Lomonosov and Benjamin Franklin. Imagine what it must have felt like for Lomonosov to receive a letter from Dr. Franklin asking his Russian counterpart for an account of his discoveries from the polar voyage in 1765. And our respected colleague, Professor Sergunin, alongside other Russian and American experts, wrote an excellent report last year. He showed that even during the worst days of the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union were able to come together around ecological concerns. The two superpowers produced a bilateral report on climate change and collaborated in the International Geophysical Year between 1957 and 1958. During this international initiative, valuable research on sea ice and extreme weather in the Arctic was produced. Even after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia was able to work with the US. The Russian-American Long-Term Consensus of the Arctic, or Rusalka for short, is a prime example of this period. The project involved many bilateral expeditions to the Bering and Chukchi Seas between 2004 and 2015. Russian and American scientists made important contributions that help us understand the changing chemistry, glaciology, and ecosystems of the Arctic. Another example of beneficial cooperation is when Russian and American scientists partnered in 2016 to study polar bear and seal populations to better understand the effects of melting sea ice on animals. Even today, Russian and American scientists recognize how important it is to collaborate in Arctic science. It is a matter of life or death for our planet that the crucial work of scientists can bypass political tensions and share important data and expertise. The US and Russia must implement the 2017 Agreement on Enhancing Arctic Scientific Cooperation. It was developed through the successful work of an Arctic Council task force. The agreement calls for reducing the obstacles to scientific collaborations such as Rusalka and the International Geophysical Year expeditions. We can already see Russia working on this in the form of the International Snowflake Arctic Research Station and inviting foreign researchers there. But the US Embassy in Moscow has stopped issuing visas to Russian citizens, and Russia declared the US an unfriendly country and put restrictions on Russian nationals working at the US Embassy. These types of obstacles, these are obstacles to effective cooperation, and they must be addressed. So in general, there are many examples of successful science cooperation in the Arctic, and such initiatives must be supported by the Arctic Council's working groups and task forces. There are many new issues, such as the emergence of viruses and diseases from thawing permafrost that would benefit from cooperative research. However, it must be said that the Arctic Council is sometimes overestimated as a binding authority. While its powers are actually limited, in the end, decisions are made by the political leadership of countries and are affected by general pressures in international relations. And although military affairs are kept out of the Arctic Council mandate, we see growing calls for military-to-military contact on the sidelines of the Arctic Council. I welcome our respected colleague Ambassador Korchunov's call for a roundtable of military experts. Many Arctic experts in the West also support this pragmatic idea, which Foreign Minister Lavrov likewise mentioned before the Council meeting, though the official US position is still ambiguous. Another question that remains is whether the Arctic states will follow the International Energy Agency's recommendation to stop all new oil and gas exploration if global warming is to be kept in check. But it's unlikely, as the Biden administration backs new ConocoPhillips oil projects in Alaska just last month, and Russia's Rosneft begins work on the Vostok oil project on the Taimur Peninsula. Even after the Norilsk oil spill disaster, that was caused by thawing permafrost, but also neglect from the Norilsk Nickel Company and the Exxon Valdez disaster that has lasting effects on the health of Arctic communities, it seems that both Russia and the US will continue with energy strategies that are overly dependent on hydrocarbons. Now, a year after the Norilsk disaster, there is no real dialogue between Norilsk Nickel and the indigenous people of the Taimur Peninsula. It remains to be seen whether the indigenous people of the North will play a role in climate adaptation policy, as they have long known of the risks of climate change with their traditional knowledge, yet are still neglected. These are likewise areas for multi and bilateral cooperation. Thank you very much, dear colleagues, for your attention. Я желаю Российской Федерации очень успешного председательства. Спасибо.
Спасибо, Павел, за освещение аспекта двусторонних отношений России и США. Безусловно, согласна с коллегами, которые выступили до, это действительно очень важные аспекты с точки зрения работы Арктического совета.
Thank you so much. And the continuous work of the Arctic Council, that's a very important topic. I understand that we can move to Q&A session, and let me mention for the viewers that they can ask the comments and ask the questions and share their comments in the chat box. As a moderator, I'd like to continue the discussion in terms of the US-Russian relations. I'd like to ask a question to Mr. Korchunov. Are there any bilateral contacts between Russia and the United States at a bilateral level, which Russia is going to intensify once it chairs the Arctic Council? Are these two domains interconnected? Thank you so much. I have very good contacts with the American representative in the Arctic Council. On a weekly basis, we get in touch and communicate in certain working formats, discussing preparation and now implementation of the instructions which proceed from the ministerial declaration of the strategic plan. These contacts are of no-nonsense nature and embrace the whole scope of the functions and responsibilities of the Arctic Council, which deals with the so-called soft security, which in turn becomes more and more significant due to the climate change and the rise in the economic and human activity in the region. It entails risks and threats for the security. Therefore, we don't have any issues in terms of how to cooperate on those issues. There is a big difference between the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation, which accounts for 1/3 of the Russian territory, and it accounts for 1/3 of the Russian export and 10% of the GDP. At the same time, the GDP of Alaska, if I'm not mistaken, last year was a little bit more than $50 billion, whereas the overall US GDP annualized is more than $2 trillion. Therefore, you can see that it is just a tiny share, a tiny contribution to the overall GDP, and hence we see how important this area is for Moscow, where the federal government. Alaska is not so significant for the United States, unlike the Arctic area, which is clearly so much important for Russia in general. Last year and this year, we see 4 US strategies. I'm speaking about the power wielding authorities such as Coast Guard Authority and the Air Force, the Navy strategy, and the fourth one. We see that military security issues come a full, and climate issues have been reinstated in the agenda once Joe Biden was sworn in, but we do not understand the shapes and outlines of the social and demographic strategy of the United States in the Arctic. It has not emerged yet. The US administration, the incumbent US administration, is only in its infancy. We are lacking certain details to know more. What the ministers agreed on in Reykjavik, they agreed to support peace in the Arctic. The Arctic is regarded as an area of constructive interaction. The Arctic Council works in that direction, but we are missing the military and political security. We have different approaches. There are two approaches, actually. The one which implies escalation, and this is when you are not prepared for a dialogue. When you have a patchwork approach, non-inconsistent one, when you try to monopolize your presence in the region using the territories of other countries, so to say. Mind you, Russia never offered its territory in the Arctic zone for the deployment of the military forces of other countries, and Russia never deployed its armed forces on the territory of other countries, except for 1944, when Russia, or the then Soviet Union, liberated Norway of the Nazi troops, but liberating Norway, the Soviet troops immediately released the territory. So our strategy is purely of a defensive nature, and whatever we are doing in the area of security, military security, we are doing on the territory of Russia. Something which we stress, we should not promote the international military activity in that area, something which we run into very often. The United Kingdom, for instance, back in 2018, published its military Arctic strategy. That's a very poor example to be followed by other nations, as far as they are somehow sending into a spiral the initiatives to promote similar strategies by other nations. We do not welcome the emergence of new dividing lines anywhere. That's the first approach, the approach of an escalation. On the contrary, there is a de-escalation approach when you're ready for a dialogue, when you are reluctant to use force, and we are ready to discuss military and political issues at the level of experts and at a high level, but probably not in the framework of the Arctic Council. The fact that Minister Lavrov mentioned the need for a dialogue on military issues, it attests to the fact that Russia sticks to a comprehensive approach, which implies responsible governance and management of the region. When the Arctic nations would focus on the soft security and hard security issues as well. But cooperation in the framework of the Arctic Council, that's the best means to strengthen security, as far as we are strengthening partnership, and we're building atmosphere of trust. We're standing up for cooperation in the name of broader partnership aimed at sustainable development of the region. We have to understand that these are the Arctic states that bear most of the responsibility for that. We have lived there for more than 1,000 years. There are organizations which come and go. They are guests on our land. We are ready to host and accommodate them, but we try to engage these nations. But the way to avoid new dividing lines, this is the philosophy of positive constructive engagement. And we will promote that under the Russian chairmanship in the Arctic Council. Thank you so much, Mr. Korchunov. Let me specify what you said. You spoke about the hot security issues and the results of the ministerial meeting between Antony Blinken and Sergey Lavrov in Reykjavik. Both ministers discussed the return to a dialogue at the level of the chiefs of staff, and Mr. Blinken declined this offer by Mr. Lavrov. What other steps can be made by the Russian Foreign Ministry in that direction? Because we are getting back to the format of roundtables. Can you name any other specific actions or specific steps? Well, first of all, I'd like to note that there is no alternative to discussing of the military issues between the Arctic nations. It takes time to realize that as the main prerequisite, as a precondition to support peace in the Arctic region, to avoid conflicts, to somehow mitigate the tensions. How much time it will take, it doesn't depend on us. In our turn, we are ready for a dialogue with our Arctic region partners. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Korchunov. I have a question to Sergey concerning the rating. I have a feeling that it is Russia which is promoting most of the economic activity there, and it possesses of the strongest ice-breaking fleet there. Well, how would you comment on that? Well, that's an excellent question. Thank you so much for this question. And we met and discussed that more than once with Mr. Sergunin, if you remember, at different roundtables and events. I clearly remember discussing these issues with Mr. Korchunov. The question which arises is as follows. We have 13 national projects in Russia, and one of these national projects is ecology, which embraces 11 federal projects. And project number 11 is called the transition to the best accessible technologies. Means that Russia today, in the framework of that national project called ecology, where its enterprises should transit to the best available technologies to transit to more energy efficient and less greenhouse gas emitting technologies, bringing down the water intensity and energy intensity, etc. Number two, whether such a comparison is adequate or not. is just or not. Certainly in terms of a number of parameters and indices, if we look at the human capital development, or since 2013 is being called human capital index, Russia is lagging behind other nations, but we have certain competitive edge. Look at the adjusted net savings. Russia is quite competitive among other Arctic Council member states. Look at the environmental footprint. We also have certain advantages there. Out of all the indicators, there are certain troublesome points. That's right. Renewables. We cannot boast their major development, but it depends on how you do your maths. Well, sometimes hydropower energy and nuclear power plants are attributed to green technologies. I think that the Arctic Economic Council and the Arctic Council and the Barents region, which is going to be chaired by Finland. We discussed that with the Council of Finland, and he asked me, how can we come to terms? How do we speak the same language? I think we have to learn in certain areas, and we can set examples in certain areas. In certain areas, Russia will have to learn its lesson, for instance, how to develop social and ecological domains, but in some aspects, Russia is no longer an outsider. Even among those 8 Arctic Council member states, these member states are leaders in terms of the sustainable development and social development. To look at the Nordic countries, in terms of SDG, they are best in the world. This is my answer. Thank you so much. My question goes to Svein. I asked a similar question to Mr. Korchunov from the very outset. What do you think, as a person from abroad, so to say? We said that however right and good initiatives Russia may suggest, unfortunately there is some political backdrop against which we have to act. As an expert, do you think Russia will find it easy to promote its initiatives to strengthen the security in the Arctic, to promote sustainable development and indigenous people's interests? Bearing in mind this dire political context, will Russia find it easy to chair the council?
I think they will find it, well, kind of easy. It depends on the ambitions, clearly. But once again, addressing the security issues, luckily I'm not a politician, I have to admit, because this is a very, very interesting and maybe a key discussion. And by doing seminars like this and having this discussion, I think that's the first step. Clearly, cooperation on security issues, at some time, we need to have cooperation on security issues in the Arctic as well, but not under the umbrella of the Arctic Council. But how and to what extent and when, it's really hard to say. But it looks like, well, seems like all of the participants here have many ideas, and they should be brought to the politicians, and then we could hopefully they could make wise decisions on this. But this is clearly a key component, because the Arctic Council show that the region of the Arctic region is mostly a region of cooperation and not security issues. So security issues should not head the Arctic agenda as it does now. But how and when, that is the politicians, well, we can only inform them, and hopefully they might make wise decisions, I guess.
Thank you so much, Sven. I'd like to raise one more issue, the sustainable development of the Arctic. Timo, in his speech, in his contribution, said it is very important that Russia raises economic issues and how to improve the activity of the Arctic Council. Timo, can you elaborate on that a little bit? What did you mean? Can you share a brief comment? And after that, I will redirect that question to Mr. Korchunov as an official representative of Russia in the Arctic Council. The Sustainable Development Fund, is it a reality, and what steps are being made on that way? Timo, over to you.
Yeah, so obviously this is a big chunk. I mean, we know that the Arctic Council has, and throughout all its history, it hasn't had any kind of automatic funding scheme. So all the projects get their kind of diversified funding from different sources. And as far as I understand, that this is not the idea behind this, the kind of sustainable funding, if not that to solve the whole thing, but at least raise the issue and try to find some constructive solutions. And I don't think that there is any kind of overarching solution to how this is going to be taken forward. I'm sure that the ambassador can elaborate more on that. I think that what I said generally about the Russian chairmanship and the kind of sustainable kind of economic development, and I would also kind of say that if I'm looking at the chairmanship program, it's very going into that direction, and in this respect, I would be agreeing with Svein that it's kind of more to that line of priorities if we compare to the previous chairmanships. And I guess that it's still, if you look at the other chairs, they have all had one way or the other this kind of idea of viability of the Arctic regions as an important component of their chairmanship, and that's quite natural. That if you are working on sustainable development issues in the Arctic regions, obviously you somehow have to address that how these regions, which are also in many places they are losing folks. There are various types of development issues there. You are trying to provide some kind of future path to these societies and kind of yeah, that's pretty much my answer. Thanks.
Спасибо большое, Николай Викторович. Да, конечно.
Thank you very much. Okay. Let's go back to Mr. Korchunov. I would divide your question into two parts. Number one, funding the Arctic Council itself, its structures, its working bodies, etc. Yes, the ministers have given us this instruction to review these matters and prepare a report, and we'll do this. And in a couple of years, we will present our recommendations to the ministers. And then there is another matter. We all want to see sustainable development in the Arctic. All the countries agree on that. And this requires sustainable finance for the region. And Russia initiated a conversation about Arctic sustainable finance, sustainable Arctic finance. We made a proposal to this effect. We asked our partners, let's have a conversation about this, because we can talk forever about black carbon and methane, but this would require modernization of transport, modernization of our production facilities, modernizing our infrastructure. Without a lot of funding, we won't be able to resolve these issues. There is growing demand from indigenous people. They face shortage of investment in their territories. Many territories are underfunded. So what needs to be done? We have the Asian Development Bank. We have the European Development Bank. But what about the Arctic? Why can't we start with some baby steps? Do something limited first. Create a project office for telecom projects, communications, other things like that. Things that are crucial for the people, you know. As soon as we get this pan-Arctic view, relying on scientific data, we will get a clearer idea of which solutions we should pursue. We need to prepare some reports on possible future scenarios for the Arctic for the period until 2040, 2050. We need to have some kind of vision for the future, including climatic and geopolitical factors, transport, global markets, the energy transition in the Arctic, in Asia, creating predictive models.
Моделей, механизмов, подходов, технологий.
Mechanisms, approaches, technologies. What will the Arctic look like in 2050 for the US, for Russia? What role will the Arctic play in their economies? For other regional countries, what about transport solutions? I think we need this kind of strategic vision. This would help us get a better understanding. So we welcome the contribution of the scientific community, you experts. We really support U-Arctic, their initiatives, what researchers do. I hope we could make some progress in this direction. I think it will get us much further, but currently we are in a situation where the European Development Bank has suspended its operation in Russia, and our major financial institutions face certain restrictions. They have difficulties borrowing on international markets, and this affects development in Russia's Arctic territories as well, because it is these financial institutions that provide funding for the Arctic. Mitigating climate change obviously requires bringing in a geopolitical aspect to this work and international cooperation. It should be clear to everybody that this cooperation, modernizing the energy industry, this should not be affected by restrictions. This is the way I think we should take. And if we take this approach, we'll get much further than where we are now. We would be much more effective working together. We could consider creating a fund for lowering greenhouse gas emissions. Russia would be willing to consider such projects for working together with our partners in the Arctic Council and observer nations. Thank you very much, Ambassador Korchunov. A development bank seems like an interesting idea. I'm not sure about reconstruction, but development, definitely. I have a question for Mr. Sergunin and Mr. Devyatkin. Please keep it brief. Non-Arctic countries are still very much interested in the Arctic. India, Singapore, they talk a lot, and China, of course, China. Does it make sense to bring in non-Arctic countries to address problems in the Arctic? What Russia thinks, what the US thinks about this? Or is it better for us to distance ourselves away from the non-Arctic countries and deal with these matters on our own? Alexander, how about we start with you? Well, Ambassador Korchunov already said that we live in the Arctic House, whereas non-Arctic countries are just visitors there. They're just guests. We are happy to see them, of course, as long as they abide by the rules of hospitality. So that's the key principle in dealing with the non-Arctic countries, including Asian ones. I think we should be very pragmatic in these matters. We should respect each other's interest, keep it mutually beneficial, use the win-win approach, and just very basically have respect for each other. For example, we work very well with South Korea in building railroads, and we built some tankers for the liquefied natural gas. We also worked with Japan very well, building the Yamal LNG gas. But then Japan, of course, joined Western sanctions, and they only completed stage 1 of this plant. But now they reconsidered, and they're re-entering this project. The next stage will probably involve Japan, and Japan is also participating in building 2 terminals for LNG, where tankers reinforced for ice shipping will be the liquefied natural gas will be converted, unloaded from those tankers, and there are other examples. So, like I said, we should be very pragmatic about it. Unfortunately, China made a lot of promises, but they made a lot of plans, a lot of grand plans. But of all those grand plans, they said there will be the terminal in Murmansk, in Arkhangelsk. They will help build the railroad connecting the coast of the White Sea. But none of those plans ever came to fruition. None of those promises became real. So we should be pragmatic. We should see the difference between promises and real works. So there should be proper balance between hopes and reality. Thank you, Alexander. Pavel, how about you? Your American view.
Thank you very much. Well, my personal view as an advocate for addressing the climate crisis, I would say I agree with the quote from a youth representative at the recent High North Dialogue. And he said, in the age of the climate crisis, we are all Arctic states. And so in that regard, exactly, if non-Arctic states, near Arctic states are willing to respect the established norms and laws, then they should be welcomed rather than pushed away, lest they would establish their own non-Arctic council to deal with issues in the Arctic. I'll continue with what I was speaking about in my opening remarks regarding the importance of scientific cooperation, and that China especially is facing severe consequences from Arctic melting ice, for example. And so similar to the tensions between the US and Russia, even though we see tensions between the US and China, climate change is mentioned in passing often, and that Biden and Xi Jinping acknowledge that the US and China should work together on addressing the climate crisis. American and Chinese scientists, for example, are already working together as part of the Mosaic expedition. Chinese scientists have invited American scientists on board their icebreaker research vessel named Shulong, Snow Dragon. And so there are plenty of opportunities for cooperation in addressing the climate crisis in the Arctic, especially regarding adaptation. And besides China, there are other observer states such as Singapore, which has a expertise in maritime studies, in marine engineering, offshore engineering. And so observer states like Singapore and other states should be welcome to contribute to the international knowledge on the developing climate crisis. If I may, I'd like to quote the Singaporean diplomat Kishore Mahbubani, who said that humans would look with pity at two tribes of apes that continue fighting over territory while the forest around them was burning. But this is how America and China will appear to future generations if they continue to focus on their differences while the Earth is facing an extended moment of great peril. And I think this applies to the climate emergency, which is disproportionately affecting the Arctic, and that Arctic states, non-Arctic states, near-Arctic states should work together to better understand what can be done about what's happening. Thank you.
Спасибо большое. Timo, что-то хотели сказать?
Timo, you wanted to add a few words, I think.
Thanks. Pavel almost said everything, but just to add, I think that many of the issues in the Arctic, they are being decided already in global forums, whether it's climate change or vessel navigation. And also, we soon we will have a Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement in force, and obviously we know that it's not only the Arctic Ocean coastal states, but also China, Japan, South Korea, Iceland, and EU on board. And I guess that the more I already took this up at this expert group on methane and black carbon. Obviously, it's very important because it really tries to induce also the observers, also the de facto observers. EU is taking part in that fairly intensely, and we are trying to think that EU and others are also trying to persuade China to take part into this expert group work, because China is really the bad entity there in terms of black carbon emissions to that land then in the Arctic. So that's a very concrete example that we need to have. Depending on what we are talking about, we need in most issues we need to have also others on board. Thanks.
Благодарю вас, Тимо, и экспертов.
Thank you, Timo and other experts. Unfortunately, we will have to wrap up our discussion, even though we have a lot of questions we want to cover. I would like to thank Ambassador Korchunov and all of our experts. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your analysis, your detailed analysis of where we are right now as Russia starts its stint of chairmanship in the Arctic Council. So let's hope we continue with expert discussions like that, maybe at the Gorchakov Foundation, and also PORA, the Project Office for Arctic Development. I just want to mention very briefly that we at our foundation, at the Gorchakov Foundation, we will continue discussing the most pressing issues of international cooperation in the Arctic. So please watch this space, and we look forward to new meetings with you. Thank you very much. Arctic development is an endless subject. We can talk about it forever. So we will continue at our next meeting. Thank you, the Gorchakov Foundation. This was very interesting 2 hours. Time flies. Thank all the experts for their contributions. Thank you, and bye-bye. The best of luck to all of you. Thank you. Bye-bye.